Good morning. My name is Natasha Oyedeli, and I'd like to welcome you to the NIH Office of Disease Prevention's Methods Mind the Gap webinar series. The series explores research design, measurement, intervention, data analysis, and other methods of interest to prevention science. Our goal is to engage the prevention research community in thought-provoking discussions to promote the use of best available methods and to support the development of better methods. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. You can submit questions during the webinar by clicking on the question mark in the WebEx toolbar. Please direct your questions to all panelists. We will open the floor to questions that have been submitted via WebEx at the conclusion of today's talk. The slides and video recording will be posted to our website, prevention.nih.gov/mindthegap in approximately 1 week. You will receive an email when they are available. Lastly, we would appreciate your feedback about today's webinar. Upon closing the WebEx meeting, you will be prompted to complete an evaluation. We would appreciate your feedback as it will help us improve this webinar series. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. David M. Murray, Associate Director for Prevention and Director of the Office of Disease Prevention.
Thank you, Natasha. Today's speaker is Dr. Harvey J. Miller. Dr. Miller is the Bob and Mary Rouchet Chair in Geographic Information Science, the Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, and Professor of Geography at The Ohio State University. He is also a courtesy professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, a member of the Faculty Advisory Board of the Sustainability Institute, and an affiliated faculty of the Translational Data Analytics Institute at Ohio State. Dr. Miller also chairs the Mapping Science Committee of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and is a member at large of the data section of the Transportation Research Board of the National Research Council. Dr. Miller's research and teaching interests are at the intersection between geographic information science and transportation, in particular, the analysis of human mobility within cities and regions. The main questions driving his research include sustainable transportation, livable cities, and the relationships between human mobility, health, and social equity. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Harvey Miller.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the seminar. What I'd like to talk about today is, how to use geospatial data to create healthy places, how we can build environments for active living, opportunistic GI science. I'll talk about some research we've done in this respect, looking at the impact of public transit on physical activity. And then I'll generalize that and talk about the idea of opportunistic GI science and how we can leverage events in the real world to form quasi or natural experiments that look at the impact of the built environment and policies on physical activity and health. So what do we mean by healthy places? Healthy places are places that encourage physical, mental, and social well-being. They facilitate physical activity and access to healthy food, minimize exposures to risks such as poor air quality, heat stress, and injuries, and are inclusive, legible, and convivial or friendly, user-friendly environments that maximize social interaction. Now, a problem we have in the United States and increasingly elsewhere is that many places are unhealthy. We have created built environments that discourage physical activity. Physical activity is often unnecessary and often unpleasant, unsafe, and unhealthy. And as we know, there are health consequences. We are seeing the rise of sedentary lifestyle diseases such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. It's a leading risk factor for mortality in the United States, and it's a fourth leading risk factor globally. And this next slide shows how this is not just a problem in the United States and even parts of Europe, but it's something that's occurring globally, and even in the developing countries of the global south, where our built environments that discourage physical activity are also being adopted in the global south, and this is becoming a global health issue. Now, one of the ways we can address this is through the idea of active living in healthy cities. So this is a concept that attempts to integrate planning and design with evidence-based health policy. These are separate areas, how we plan to design the built environment and evidence-based health policy that are now being integrated. The idea is that we treat planning and design interventions as experimental interventions or changes in the environment, and we use data collection and evaluation to determine whether or not these were successful interventions. And you'll see this under a number of science and policy initiatives. There's concepts such as healthy cities, active living research, the idea of complete streets, which I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation, and the active design of building interiors to encourage physical activity. Now, this is all well and good, but there are some problems here. The problems are that human systems are complex. So when I say complex, I don't mean complicated. I mean complexity theory, the fact that we have emergent properties as individuals interact with each other in the environment, and the things that occur at the aggregate level can be surprising from a complexity theory perspective. And this means that policy interventions can have unclear and sometimes counterintuitive outcomes. So the solutions I'd like to present this morning are an ecological approach that looks at the entire lifestyle, all facets of healthy living, and also evidence-based policy. And the strategies I'll discuss are opportunistic GI science and geographic information observatories, which are methods for facilitating opportunistic GI science. And I will define these terms more precisely later in my presentation. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll first talk about healthy environments. Many people on this webinar may be familiar with this, but just in case, we'll review what we mean by healthy environments. We'll talk about design interventions and the ecological approach. I'll mention the real-world experiment we conducted, the Moving Across Places study in Salt Lake City. It answered the question, does public transit generate new physical activity? And then I'm going to generalize this and talk about opportunistic GI science and the use of geographic information observatories to leverage real-world events so that these type of analyses that we saw in the MAP studies, and you will see in this webinar, are not one-off events, but something that can be done on a continuous, ongoing basis. So we talk about physical activity by design. One of the first places we start are the 5 Ds of walkability. So these are the elements that must be in place for a neighborhood to be considered walkable. There's a diversity of activities. There are many things to do, not just residential, not just shopping, not just workplaces, but all mixed together. There's a sufficient density in these neighborhoods. Distance to public transit is reasonable. There's easy access to destinations even beyond the public transit network, such as walking and biking, and also street design. Street design is a very important part of this. Of the 5 Ds, it's the most difficult to quantify. The other 4 are very quantifiable. Design tends to be more qualitative and requires some more in-depth exploration and deeper dives into what are the design features of the urban environment that can lead to physical activity. Now, a concept has emerged in the last few years called complete streets, and the idea is that streets are incomplete if they're only for automobiles. Roads should be habitats for all users, pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users. And on the right side of the screen, you will see that there are there's a same street scene in New York City before and after a complete streets intervention. Previously, it was an environment that was conducive only to automobile traffic, and all other users were basically peripheral or denigrated. But afterwards, we could see some of the improvements. We see bike lanes. We see, bus rapid transit or dedicated bus lanes, more clearly marked crosswalks. And these are the design features that help to improve walkability and give people a safe and convivial environment for conducting physical activity. Now, this has also been brought into the interior of buildings, something called active design. So these are urban design strategies that encourage walking, biking, active transportation, recreation, and building designs that promote active living where we work, play, and live through things such as the placement and design of stairs, elevators, and indoor and outdoor spaces. So most of us are familiar with many buildings in the United States where you enter and the elevator is right in front, but if you want to take the stairs, it's often pushed into a corner. They're scary, isolated chambers, where you wouldn't want to be alone too long. These are things that discourage physical activity within our buildings. So on the right side of the screen, the lower half, you'll see an example from China in Hangzhou, where we have the escalator on one side, but we also have these stairs with these very nice keyboards design, but that stair is actually musical, that when you walk up that stair, it actually plays notes on the keyboard. And when they did this design intervention, it led to more people taking the stairs from the subway station than taking the escalator. So this is all well and good. We see that sometimes the design interventions work quite well. However, sometimes they don't. There's often unclear outcomes from these design interventions. And on this screen, I see several news articles and also a Transportation Research Board report that talks about these issues, the fact that rich people walk and bike for different reasons than poor people, so how we would design a walking and biking environment for rich people and poor people needs to be different. There's evidence that if you stand more at work, you sit more at home. There's gender gaps in biking and other physical activity. There's problems with air pollution where biking along busy traffic corridors can actually lead to more harm to your health than being physically inactive. Of course, that's debatable, but it does point out that there are some very complex things going on in urban environments that can make these design interventions, the outcomes to be unexpected and not as straightforward as we thought. Now, why would this occur? Well, there's several reasons. One is endogeneity. For example, we talk about interventions like complete street interventions. Is this attracting new physical activity, or are we just providing complete streets for people who would walk anyways? Are people self-selecting for walking neighborhoods and we're not really generating new physical activity? Context dependence, walkability near home is very different than the requirements for walkability near work. Social factors, socioeconomic status, age, gender roles, these affect our activities over the course of a day, our scheduling constraints, and whether or not design interventions will actually be effective for these different social groups. Compensation effects, I mentioned in the previous slide, standing at work leads to more sitting at home. At least there's some preliminary evidence for that. And again, unhealthy environments, air quality in urban canyons where pollution is concentrated, heat stress, which is going to be more and more of a public health issue as climate change continues to make the world warmer, including where I live in Columbus, Ohio. We've seen an increase in temperatures, and there's concerns locally about cooling the city to encourage physical activity. And something called sick buildings, these buildings that are sealed and only fed by HVAC, and sometimes that can lead to poor air quality. As we make buildings more energy efficient, we can actually make the buildings less healthy for breathing and physical activity. Now, this was described very well in an article in Nature in 2016 by Pollack, and he talked about the problem with policy interventions and design interventions to address cities and obesity. He noted that there's multiple layers of feedback, positive and negative loops that are feedback loops that are nested within each other that can make design interventions very, very difficult. So here, or I should say unclear, the outcomes from design interventions unclear. So these are the major processes that affect the relationship between individuals and obesity within urban environments. It's a matter of how much stress they feel, their normal levels of exercise, what kind of diet, what their commute is like. And an intervention in only one part of this can echo through these positive and negative feedback loops and actually lead to unexpected outcomes, including counterproductive outcomes from these design interventions. So we have to take into account the complex nature of the urban environment and the complex nature of human activities if we really want to get effective design interventions that will make our built environments healthier. So Saliz and his colleagues in recent years in 2006 talked about this, the need that we need an ecological approach to creating active living communities. We can't think of things in piecemeal or isolated. What we need to do is think of the entire life of a person, the entire environment in which they operate. We need to think about their interpersonal characteristics, the demographics, biological, family situation, their perceived environment, the different active living domains, recreation, commuting, household activities, occupation. Embed this within behavioral settings, including the physical setting in which these activities occur. And finally, what is the policy environment? What are the policy things that we're doing within a city that influences not only the built environment, but other types of like taxation, subsidizing certain types of transportation, that all influence whether or not a design intervention will actually lead to individuals becoming more physically active. So it's a very complex, multifaceted situation in which we're trying to intervene and make these environments healthier. So the ecological approach to healthy design looks at multiple levels of influence: personal characteristics, behavioral domains, physical settings, and policy environments. It's holistic. We look at all facets of active living. And it also needs to be evidence-based. We want objective measures more than self-reports. We want longitudinal studies rather than just a cross-section or a moment in time. And of course, experiments are our gold standard for establishing causality. Now, the trouble with doing this in the real world is that, well, it's difficult. In the lab, we can randomly sort participants between cases and controls, and then we can see how an experimental condition leads to changes in behavior or changes in outcome. Well, the trouble is that the real world is not the lab. In the real world, this can be infeasible and also can be unethical in some situations. We can't withhold, for example, healthy policies or interventions from some people just to see what will happen. So, we can get beyond this problem by forming quasi and natural experiments in the real world. Quasi experiments correspond to planned events or interventions in the real world, and natural experiments correspond to unplanned or natural, somewhat random events in the real world. And I'm going to talk a bit about a quasi-experiment in just a moment. An example of a natural experiment would be some disturbance that happens in the urban environment. For example, a few months ago in Columbus, we suddenly had hundreds of scooters dropped on our city street. I know that's happened in other cities, Washington, D.C., other places. And this had uncertain effects on whether this led people to drive less and walk. Is it safe? These are things that just happen without any plan. This was something that was done by the private sector, but it's something that could have been leveraged if we were ready to collect the data and see, well, what is the effect of this disruption on the physical activity and health of the residents of our city. So the experiment I want to highlight right now is the Moving Across Places study, or MAPS. I'd like to say I came up with this acronym for the study, but one of the grad students did on this project who got a gold star for that acronym. Being a geographer, I love it. And this was a study of the impacts of light rail transit and complete streets on physical activity in Salt Lake City, Utah, where I used to live and where I used to be a faculty member. And this is a quasi-experiment. So what happened was that we knew they were going to build this light rail line, and they were going to build complete streets interventions, wider sidewalks, more vegetation, street furniture along this light rail line. We knew this was coming. We applied for funding and got it. And we designed a experiment where we had the same participants before and after these planned interventions. And it's a quasi-experiment because we sorted people into case and control depending upon where they live relative to the light rail line. So this will be a little clearer in this next slide. What you see here along the right here is the existing light rail line in downtown Salt Lake City, and the dotted line right here with the circles, that's the proposed new light rail line through this neighborhood. It connected downtown Salt Lake City to the international airport. You see two lines on that map. The blue line are the near group, the people who live within 1 kilometer of a light rail stop. Those are the people who are likely to use light rail after this intervention. The red line encompasses the control group. Those are people who lived in the same neighborhood, but were not close enough to light rail that it was likely that they would use it. And the reason why those lines are jagged is because they're based upon walking distance along the sidewalk network. So the blue line is everyone who lives within 1 kilometer walking distance along the sidewalk network to one of those light rail stops. And the area between the blue line and the red line is people who live within farther than 1 kilometer, but within 2 kilometers of one of the light rail stops. So what we did is we did some data collection. We did height and weight measurements of participants and also gave them attitudinal surveys. And then we gave them small GPS and accelerometers to wear for 1 week. This was different weeks over the course of the year before they built the light rail line in 2012 and then 2013 after. And we had 536 people complete both phases of the study. On the top part, you see some of the height and weight measurements. Those are not participants. Those are some of our graduate students pretending to be participants. And what would happen is that the graduate students, research assistants, would go and drop off the GPS and accelerometer and give them an attitudinal survey and do these height and weight measurements. And then they'd pick up the device a week later, and while they were there, they would plug in the GPS and accelerometer to a laptop, and that was uploaded, fused, and map matched, and then downloaded for participant review. So on the bottom of the screen here, you see an example of the screen that we would present to participants. And that, by the way, is not any participant data. That is my bike ride to work when I used to live in Salt Lake City, my bike ride to work to University of Utah. And we would, if we detected a bout of physical activity, we would ask people, well, do you recall this activity? Here's the date and time. Here's where it was. If they skipped yes, there'd be further screens asking them questions like, what did you feel safe? Was it convivial? What was the purpose of this trip? And things like that. Now, the company we worked with, Westat, we use their software, and this software is able to take the position from the GPS and also the accelerometer data, fuse it, and do semi-automated mode detection. We were able to detect from the GPS signature and the fused accelerometer signature whether or not they were walking, biking, in a car, on a bus, or on the light rail system. It's semi-automated because it did require interventions by research assistants to manually flag some of it when there were borderline cases, but most of the cases were handled automatically based on our review. Here's what the data looked like. This is both time periods, 2012 on the left screen, 2013 on the right screen, and these are the GPS traces of the participants, color-coded by whether they lived in the case region or the control region, where they lived near the light rail line or further away from the light rail line. And I like to say this is big geographic data because it's a type of data where we just can't map it like I'm showing you here, because that doesn't really tell us anything. We have to be a little more clever about how we dice and sort and analyze this in order to make sense of this really large mass of GPS and accelerometer data. Now, the other thing we did is we did a walkability audit using the Irvine, Minnesota inventory. And this is a way of 160 attributes. It's basically an instrument for collecting data. And we sent survey participants, we sent research assistants into the neighborhood, and they mapped every single block face in 2012 and 2013 based upon these 6 dimensions of walkability. And we did a validation, and we found that we sent 2 different RAs down the same block, and we checked to make sure that their ratings were consistent with each other, and we had good validation. So this map here is showing the neighborhood, and it's showing the attractiveness for walking. And this corresponds to what we know about Salt Lake City, because the green area to the north there in the center, that's a residential neighborhood, but the other areas that are red and yellow, which are rated poor for attractive walking, those are industrial areas and other areas with high traffic. Now, the major project aims, and before I get into next slide, I should mention that we did this so that we were able to measure the relationship between physical activity and the built environment, and also make sure that there weren't changes in this built environment that beyond the intervention I mentioned, light rail and complete streets. Here are the major project aims, the 4 major aims, and you can see papers there that where we published results from these aims. We saw increases in transit riders, cyclists, and pedestrians in this neighborhood. We saw that living proximal led to larger activity increases. Perceived attitudes of perceived walkability, so people who think it's walkable and also are pro-neighborhood seem to have greater use of this intervention, the complete streets and light rail intervention. And we saw that complete street users, people who use this light rail line and walked on this complete street intervention that paralleled the light rail line, had healthy physical activity and BMI changes. We also did some other studies where we looked at walking in the built environment, and my PhD student, Calvin Tribby, who's doing a postdoc at NIH, actually led these 3 studies that comprise his dissertation. We came up with ways of summarizing walkability and visualizing it. We assessed what are the appropriate geographic regions for analyzing walking trips, and also looked at the predictors of walking route choice through built environments. Another study we did is we found that the light rail line did not cannibalize bus ridership. That's something you hear sometimes about light rail. You're just shifting people from cheap modes of public transportation to more expensive, and we found that that wasn't the case. But the study I want to highlight right now is the question, does public transit generate truly new physical activity? And you may wonder, well, why is that a question? Because we know that transit users are more active based on self-reports and cross-sectional analysis. But this may not be new physical activity, which undermines the claimed health benefits of public transit. Is this possibly not new physical activity? There are confounding factors, other non-transit factors such as density and the activity mix in the neighborhood can influence that, and also a substitution effect. If people spend more time commuting to work in public transit, they may have less time for recreational walking. And this is a matter of everyone has a limited time budget over the course of a day, and we know that taking public transit takes more time than driving to work, so people are just shifting their physical activity from recreational walks in the evening, like with their dog or with their partner, to commuting to work. We haven't really generated new physical activity, we just shifted it. So what we did in this study is that we defined physical activity bouts as a minimum of 5 minutes with a minimum of 1,000 accelerometer counts per minute. And that's roughly moderate to vigorous physical activity. It's not a slow saunter, but it's also not necessarily running. It's just walking with purpose, I would describe it. And then looking through the data, because we know the mode of every segment of these GPS trajectories, because of the accelerometer data, we divided physical activity into two categories. Transit-related physical activity, this was physical activity within a trip that contains a bus or light rail transit ride. Non-physical activity was physical activity that did not use bus or light rail at some point during the episode. And then the two of them together is overall physical activity. And what we did is that we defined a public transit user objectively based upon the data we saw, whether or not the participant rode bus or light rail at least once during the data collection week. And based upon that, we divided people into 4 groups. There was the never group, the largest group, that did not ride public transit based on our observations either in 2012 or 2013, either before or after the new light rail. We had some people who continued their behavior, who rode public transit before and then rode after this new intervention. We have a group that stopped riding public transit based upon our observation. They rode in 2012 but stopped riding in 2013. And then we have new people. We have people who did not ride public transit in 2012 based upon our observations, but after this new light rail line, they started riding public transit. So these are the groups we're going to analyze, and these are our hypotheses. So there's 2 groups that did not change their behavior, the never or continued group. For the never group, we should see no change in physical activity based on our measurements because there's no change in other types of physical activity outside of light rail. They never rode light rail. I mean, we should see no other change in physical activity, meaning that there's no confounding effects. There wasn't some other change in the built environment that led to them being more physically active. The continued group should see no change in other physical activity outside of light rail, but they could have a change in their overall physical activity because perhaps now they're walking shorter distances to get to a light rail station. Now, the other 2 groups that change their behavior are the ones we're really interested in here. The former group, the people who stop riding light rail, we should see a decrease in physical activity overall, and that should be totally related to decrease in physical activity related to transit with no increase in other physical activity. In other words, the decrease we measured can be traced directly to the new transit, and not some other factor outside of the transit intervention. While the new people, the people who started riding public transit, we should see an increase in their total physical activity, which is related entirely to the increase in physical activity associated with transit with no other outside factor, no decrease, there's no substitution of transit-related physical activity for other physical activity. And I should say that about the former group as well. We don't want to see a substitution effect in the other direction. The fact that they're spending less time in public transit doesn't mean they should up their physical activity outside of public transit. So here's the results. We did in fact see no significant change in the 2 groups that didn't change their public transit behavior. never continued, while the former group, we saw, this is their total physical activity time, we saw a significant decrease in the amount of time they spent in physical activity, and this is normalized by 10 hours wear period. So the former group saw a significant decrease in physical activity, while the new group saw a significant increase in physical activity time. And this is time, by the way, I should mention. This is related to changes in physical activity associated with transit. The former group saw a decrease, while the new riders saw an increase in physical activity. But there was no change in physical activity no significant change outside of transit. So in other words, there were no significant changes among the group that didn't change their behavior, as well as the group that did, which means there were no confounding effects in the environment that led to these observed changes in physical activity. And being a geographer, I like to map things. So this is showing the GPS and accelerometer points. And what we're doing is we're using the GPS and accelerometer data to identify hotspots of physical activity. On the left side, you see from 2012 the hotspots for physical activity. And you can see that they're all clustered mostly on the existing light rail lines. I should mention, by the way, these little triangles here are bus stops. So we're actually looking at all the public transit stops, both light rail and bus in this region. So this is 2012 on the left side of the screen. On the right side of the screen, you see 2013, and you can see that 3 of the 5 new light rail stations generated hotspots for physical activity. Why did the middle 2 not generate hotspots for physical activity? That's an industrial area, and also the Utah State Fairgrounds are there, so not many people are living there. It just shows that it's not just a design intervention, but also the characteristics of the land uses around the design intervention, the light rail in this case, that influence physical activity. This is showing people who continue riding public transit on the left side in 2012 versus 2013 on the right side. And here we see evidence that people who were public transit riders even before this intervention just were walking shorter distances to new light rail stops. And this is showing former versus new. Most of the people who stopped riding light rail were in the city center surrounding existing light rail stops. We don't quite understand that yet. We've been looking into that. And we could see here's the people who started riding public transit here on the right side of the screen. And we could see that those 3 of the 5 light rail stops generated this new physical activity associated with transit. So to summarize, we saw no change in the physical activity in the people who did not, change their public transit behavior. The people who stopped using public transit, we saw a decrease in physical activity, totally related to their transit behavior. And the people who started using transit, we saw an increase, again, completely related to their change in transit-related physical activity and not to some outside factor. We saw no confounding factors. We see no substitution for non-transit physical activity. So therefore, we can conclude from this study that the transit physical activity is truly new physical activity, and we can claim that public transit, at least in this case, had a positive impact on physical activity and health in this region. And I don't have this in the presentation, but we actually measured BMI, and we saw that the people who stopped using public transit had a significant decrease in BMI, while people who started using public transit had a significant increase in BMI. Not a large increase or decrease, but a very tight, low variance increase, showing that even within a year, we saw healthy changes and unhealthy changes among some in BMI. Now, this was all well and good. This was a great study. Enjoyed being part of it. A very productive study in terms of publications. But it was a one-off experiment with a limited study horizon. It was the anticipated event, and we did a 5-year study, and we just didn't have the funding to do follow-up activity measurement. But what about unanticipated events? And what about policies with complicated outcomes and time horizons? And I always like to go back to this example. When was this? I think in 2016 or so, when the DC Metro shut down all day with 1-day notice for emergency investigation. Probably people who live in the National Capital Region remember that day. When that happened, I thought to myself, man, imagine if we had the apparatus set up where we could understand what were the impacts on activity, daily activities, people, how they organized events, and their physical activity. That would tell us a lot about the influence of public transit on physical activity, and the impact of a catastrophic event such as shutting down an entire subway system for a city on how people react to those type of major events. This leads to the idea of observatory science. Now, what observatory science is ongoing data collection based on a favored view supported by technology and organizational processes, such as this observatory, this astronomical observatory in the picture there. We have a telescope, it's on a hilltop away from city lights, and there's an organization of scientists and administrators to make sure that the data collection and analysis continues on an ongoing basis. Why do we do this? We do this to discover, in physical science, we've done this to discover new and surprising hypotheses. We also want to understand complex multi-scale dynamics. And we will also for monitoring policy. An example of that is volcano observatories. In most places in the world where there's an active volcano and population nearby, there's a volcano observatory not only for science, but also for reaction in case the volcano becomes active, to warn people to get out of the way. And also the reason why we do observatory science or ongoing data collection is because we're ready. We always have a baseline when something happens in the real world. Now, we've seen observatory science for many, many years in astronomy. We also seen it in biology and physical sciences. We haven't seen as much with the human sciences. We have seen some. There is a tradition of social observatories, especially for public health, where we collect and integrate data about a social phenomena focused on a particular place or region. But recently, there's been the rise of something called web observatories, and this is basically taking the web data out there, collecting, sharing, and querying it to understand what is the information universe implied by the World Wide Web. So a web observatory is basically a middleware for broad data, all the complex data from diverse web sources. And this is showing you on the right side of the screen in architecture for a real-time web observatory. Don't worry about the details of the architecture. It's just basically trying to highlight the fact that it's a combination of observatory portfolio or portals, data and visualization and analytical tools. So recent years, there's been a concept related to geographic information that's emerged called Geographic Information Observatories. This is the idea of integrating and analyzing the broad geographic data associated with a place or region. We do this for one of two reasons. One is to actually observe the geographic information itself, to explore and analyze the poorly understood geographic information universe, the universe implied by our combined geographic information. But we also can use it as a geographic observatory to study the real world through the geographic information it produces and consumes. And we all know that we live in a data world. We're all walking around with supercomputers in our pockets. We're constantly ingesting information and then giving off information and what's sometimes called data exhaust from this as a byproduct of daily activities. Now, this is something that's being worked on in several places. In the upper left there, you see the Urban Observatory Project from ESRI, and that is basically, if you publish to their website, you can see 3 different cities. In this case, I believe it's New York, London, and Berlin, showing traffic at the same moment in time. So it's a way of comparing cities around the world. In the upper right, you see POI Pulse, which was from Grant McKenzie, who did his PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and he developed basically an observatory of the dynamics of Los Angeles based upon social media check-ins. And in the bottom left, you see something we're working on here at Ohio State called the Columbus Urban and Regional Information Observatory, which is a data dashboard integrating all the geographic information that's available publicly in Columbus, Ohio. And it's actually live. You can play with it yourself. It's at curio.osu.edu, and I encourage you to, after I'm done speaking, to log in and check out some of the work we've done there to create a data dashboard to observe the geographic information in Columbus. So this idea of observatory and opportunistic GI science basically culminates in geographic knowledge discovery, construction, and use that leverages planned and unplanned events in the real world. And this is facilitated by our ability to collect geographic information persistently over time. There are 3 facets to this: opportunistic observation, opportunistic experiments, and opportunistic decision-making. So as I mentioned, one of the problems we're facing in looking at human and human natural systems is that they're complex from a complexity theory point of view. We know that they're shaped very strongly by the context in which the interactions occur, and also history, path dependence, and lock-in. So we're not going to be able to figure out like universals or general principles by just looking at one place at one time, and especially when it comes to policy interventions. What we need to do is conduct ongoing parallel observations. We need to do this in different geographic contexts, different cities, using the same data protocols and same measurements over time periods sufficient to elucidate temporal dynamics, whether they're short-term, medium-term, or long-term, and also having a baseline so that when something happens in the real world, when they shut down your subway system with a day notice, or when someone dumps hundreds of scooters in your cities, the baseline is there. We didn't know this was going to happen. It's an opportunity for a natural experiment. In some of these experiments, we want to leverage geographic data. Again, we always have the baseline measure of the mundane events. We can use these unplanned events as opportunities for natural experiments, but also do it in a way that we can recognize complex policy outcomes. The fact that for some policy outcomes, there's non-binary outcomes. Some people benefit, some people don't benefit. The benefits can be uneven. And this is also a way that we can tailor these interventions so that as we do small-scale interventions and learn in a reflective way about who's winning, who's losing, who's benefit, who's not, we can tailor these interventions as we scale them outward to other neighborhoods and to other cities. And of course, also over multiple time horizons, as I mentioned before. So on the right side of the screen, I'm just referencing a paper I wrote with Kristen Toll at Microsoft Research. The idea of what type of spatial and temporal data is available that allows us, what type of spatial and temporal big data is available, I should mention. In other words, data that's just available, out there in cities, that we can use that found data, this data exhaust, in order to design healthy built environments in our cities. The other thing we want to do is not just collect data. We also want to make our observatory into virtual laboratories. The reason is that learning from evidence can be slow with complex systems, and we know this from complexity theory. We can have lots of data and observe it over time, but because of these things such as feedback loops, delays, nonlinearities, self-organization, and path dependence, now information knowledge comes out very slowly because of the nature of complex systems. So one of the things we'd like to do in these geographic information observatories is create virtual laboratories that involve simulation, agent-based modeling, geosimulation, that integrate empirical and simulated data and allow us to perform experiments that are infeasible in the real world, and also make some predictions about what's going to happen in the future, at least the range of possibilities based upon policy interventions in the present. I also encourage you to Google the word digital twin. That's something that's come out of industry where they develop digital simulations of physical processes. This is something now you're starting to see with cities where people are talking about developing high fidelity, high resolution simulations of cities. And this idea actually has somewhat of a history. Back in 1993, David Gelernter, who's a Yale computer scientist, talked about he looked into the future and saw that all this data was going to be streaming into databases in the future. So he invented the concept of mirror world, the idea that we can create virtual reality that's tightly coupled to the real world via streaming data. A mirror world is a real-time, comprehensive, detailed, interactive, and discoverable portrayal of the real-world system. So the idea here is that with all this data coming in, we can imagine it as a virtual reality, but not a virtual reality that's separate from reality, but a virtual reality that mimics or mirrors the real world in a way that we're interacting this virtual reality in the way we interact in the real world, but in a much more controlled and also setting where we can perform some of these design changes and experiments, in a virtual laboratory. So this is a tool for investigating and managing reality, helps scientists, leaders, and citizens work together to understand these complex real-world systems, including what makes a city healthy. And this is where we'll be going with this as we start to see continuing advances in virtual reality. So to conclude, human systems are complex. We know that policy interventions can have unintended consequences. Designing healthy places is a good example. Geographic data collection has become much, much easier, and there's opportunities for natural experiments that are happening all the time in our cities and regions. So geographic information observatories are a way of going beyond these one-off experiments such as the MAP study and being able to do this on an ongoing basis, not only for new types of discovery in science, but also for better policy and design interventions to make our cities healthier places. What are the concerns here? Well, we have to worry about experimental ethics. The real-world experiments are not always innocent. You can ask Facebook when they gave people happy versus sad news and looked at their reactions, and this led to a big outcry. We also, of course, have to worry about privacy. And in the paper I mentioned earlier with Kristen Toll, we talked about how 3D urban models, when there's major advances happening right now in 3D urban models, that can be a mechanism for managing privacy in this very highly measured, high-resolution world. We also have to be careful about data hubris, and I encourage you to read this article I'm referencing here by Lazare et al. It was in Science in 2014, and they talked about the Google flu phenomenon, where at first Google flu, looking at queries on Google for flu-like symptoms, predicted the CDC data really well, and then after a year or so, it started to overpredict. And there were several reasons. One was that the people didn't understand the processes that generated the data. It turned out the Google engineers changed the search algorithm, but also it led to a positive feedback loop, an echo chamber. As people heard about Google flu predicting the flu, they started Googling Google flu, and that led to this bootstrapping where they began to wildly overpredict the actual cases of flu. So this means that we can't just take all this data and just think that, it's the truth. We have to respect our theories and also remember that administrative or scientifically measured data and carefully measured data is as important as all this found data we can extract from the real world. So thank you very much for your attention this morning. There are 3 papers that I referenced explicitly in this talk, and they're available at that website that you see on top of the screen. And I also want to acknowledge funding from the National Cancer Institute for the MAP study. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Very interesting presentation, both the specifics of the study that you described in detail and the more general material. We have some questions from our audience. One question that came in early was whether the quasi-experiment that you described was making use of real-world participants, and I think the answer to that question is absolutely yes. You were.
Yes.
How did you find them? How did you sample them?
This is a neighborhood in Salt Lake City that had a lot of. It's a low-income neighborhood that's a lot of turnovers. That was one issue. We had to recruit like 1,000 people to get about 536. Most people didn't drop out of the study, but basically moved out of the neighborhood. It's near the international airport, so again, it's not a high-income neighborhood. But how do we recruit these people? We basically went through, letters. It being Utah, we went through the local Mormon ward system and actually recruited, some of the religious leaders to announce this during their Sunday services. Did a lot of, outreach in the community. So basically, we did a very, I don't want to say aggressive, but very proactive recruitment in the neighborhood in order to attract these participants.
Mm-hmm. Another question has to do with comparability. So you didn't have the opportunity to randomize people to either live close to the transit line or far away from it, and you certainly didn't randomize people to be former transit users, current transit users, new or so forth. So there are questions about comparability of the two geographic areas, and there are questions about comparability of the study groups that you were comparing. Right. How did you consider that? How did you take a look at that kind of comparability question? Right,
very good question. Certainly, this is not, the quasi-experiment is not as powerful as a fully randomized experiment. There's no question about that. There's going to be a little bit of noise in the system. What we did to kind of control that noise is we chose the control group to be people outside the case group, but within the same neighborhood. So the socioeconomic characteristics of all our participants were the same. We looked at, based on our survey data, when we asked people basic attitudinal questions, we collected socioeconomic data from them, and we looked to see whether there was any difference between the case control people. We didn't see any significant difference. And we also looked at our sample relative to census data. and we didn't see any major differences from what the census data tells us about the neighborhood. So that's the way we looked at that. We couldn't really sort people, but we can do comparisons afterwards to see whether or not they truly are comparable groups.
So you knew from some data that the areas were similar. Did you have measures on individuals that you could include in the analyses to adjust for when you're looking at the outcomes?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, we had, when we gave them these attitudinal surveys and asked about pro-neighborhood and pro-walking questions, we asked for basic demographic data.
Okay.
So yes, we did have individual level data.
Right.
Did I answer your question?
That was very helpful.
Yeah.
You showed effects within 4 groups. And of course, the number of people in each of those groups varied. I wondered about the net effect of adding the transit line. Did you consider whether there was a net effect in terms of more activity versus after the transit line went in?
Right.
Overall, because what we saw was some change in a good direction in some folks and the change in the other direction in other folks. What was the net effect?
Yeah, right. And again, most people didn't change their behavior at all, of course, in that neighborhood. But we weren't really studying whether or not, this had a positive net effect in the neighborhood overall. What we really did is treat the people who changed their transit behavior as the experimental variable. And we wanted to know for people who changed their transit behavior whether or not this was, whether or not this led to healthy increases in physical activity and whether this was new physical activity. But we did do some side studies where we looked at the impact on bus ridership, and we didn't see any cannibalization of bus ridership. We did see increased usage of the street with the light rail and complete streets intervention. So we saw more people afterwards walking on those streets based on our observations in the neighborhood. So yeah, net effect we really don't know, to be honest. We were just concerned about the people who switched their public transit behavior and whether or not this was healthy and led to healthier more physical activity.
Yeah. Well, certainly it's very difficult to evaluate this kind of intervention in a randomized trial. It might even be impossible. And the use of pre-post quasi-experimental design with measurement of potential confounders is another way to look at it.
Right.
And that's what you've done here. You've also hinted at a quite different method, namely simulations and modeling, probably agent-based modeling, as a way to try to evaluate the impact of an intervention like this. Those kinds of methods work well if there's lots of data on the processes that are involved, and the challenge is often getting the data so that you can put it into the computer program and then use it to look at things. Do you know of examples where those methods have been used to evaluate policy level or environment level interventions targeting physical activity?
I'm not aware of physical activity or public health, but I am aware of these type of tools actually becoming a standard in transportation planning. For example, a number of years ago, there was a software called TransSims that allows us to model the traffic dynamics and travel dynamics in the city at the level of each individual person over the course of the day. And what happens in these simulations is that you take census data to make sure that your aggregate outcomes are consistent with what you've measured in the real world. And also you can collect data on that relate people's socio-demographic characteristics with their likely activity patterns over the course of the day, and then generate a synthetic population and use that to model the dynamics overall. There's TransSims is one software that does that. I just became aware of another one called Replica that does that. That's actually a commercial software that they're trying to sell to transportation planners that does what I described. It basically ties down the simulation to census data and to other data such that, at least in the aggregate, you know that your simulation matches with the real world. Now, of course, some of the things we're trying to simulate are things that are very difficult to measure directly. We could enhance those simulations by doing surveys or choice experiments that give us at least the rules that people use in order to make transportation decisions, and then feed that into an agent-based model. There's been a lot of work recently on using machine learning. There's a lot of work on machine learning in general everywhere, but there's been some work on using machine learning where we can use, like, for example, cell phone data and other types of data and activity patterns, social media, in order to infer what are the distribution of different activity schedules over the course of a typical day, and then use that to feed into the rules for the simulation.
We have a question of a different sort, wondering whether we should change the design of our cities from car-centric to human-centric, and wondering who's championing that kind of movement. I'm not sure if that's a question you can answer, but I thought I would share that one with you.
It is a question. Me, among many people, yeah, that's actually a big push now in transportation science and planning. The idea that we have designed cities for automobiles, essentially, and then what we have are cities that facilitate traffic, and we have made other forms of transportation not only difficult, not only challenging, but in some cases impossible. So there is a movement now towards planning cities around people. Complete streets is one part of it, but that's only one piece of it. Part of it's also land use. You can't really separate land use and transportation. So, for example, in my city in Columbus, they just announced a new planning framework called Insights 2050, where they've chosen 5 corridors radiating out from downtown to the edge of the city, where they're going to try to incentivize high-density development and then provide those corridors with high-quality public transit and bike infrastructure. So this is what's happening now. This is the changing paradigm in transportation planning, away from facilitating fast, free-flowing traffic to thinking about people and how they interact in a city, and planning our land use and transportation systems around people, not vehicles.
Yeah,
there's a lot of people advocating that.
Yeah, it seems like there would be opportunity for some natural experiments looking at neighborhoods that have been, or even small communities that have been developed more recently with the goal of making them quite walkable and human-centric, perhaps not whole cities, but at least sections or neighborhoods or small communities, and comparing those to other areas that aren't using those methods, and trying to get some sense of impact. Have you seen anything like that?
In fact, I have. There's something called New Urbanist and New Urbanist Design. You can look that up. New urbanism is basically old urbanism. It's kind of a misnomer. New urbanism is trying to get cities back to the way they were before cars dominated cities. And there are a lot of design principles associated with new urbanist developments and new urbanist communities. And there's been studies of that to show that neighborhoods that are designed along new urbanist lines lead to less traveling by car, more physical activity, more social cohesion, stronger social capital. People know their neighbors better, safer neighborhoods. So that's basically the type of intervention that people are looking at. Car-dominated neighborhoods versus new urbanist communities, and occasionally, historical neighborhoods, which were originally designed to be walkable, or at least they were designed in a pre-automobile era. So you are seeing some of these, like, I guess I'd call it case control, or at least cross comparisons between different types of neighborhoods.
We have an observation from another listener that you had mentioned earlier in your remarks, that travel by public transit always takes longer than car travel. Or something like that. And her observation was that while that may very well be true in most or all of the U.S., there are other parts of the world where that isn't true. And having just returned from Norway, I can tell you that you can get from downtown Oslo to the airport in almost nothing flat on their wonderful train. And I'm sure if I had tried to drive it, it would have taken much longer.
Absolutely correct. I should have qualified that and said, in the United States, in most cities, it takes longer to use public transit than to drive. Not true in European cities, which are denser, historic city cores, and also they've provided other ways to move around besides automobiles. I've spent plenty of time in Europe. I often lament the fact that I wasn't born Dutch, because I really like those type of cities that are very bike and pedestrian oriented. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The reason why it takes longer in the United States is because we've defined cities that way.
All right, we are running out of time, unfortunately, because we still have other questions that we haven't gotten to. But thank you very much for a terrific presentation. I'm going to turn this back to Natasha.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be posting the slides and recording of today's session on our website next week. You will receive an email with a link to the recording when it is available. Thank you.